another totally packed room full of awesome arrival guests. Welcome. Everyone can be quiet. Okay, yes, this mic is not very strong, so we're going to talk really loud and close into it. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This talk and all of our programming in the Lodge is sponsored by Appraisal Bureau, so thank you so much. We can give a hand to them. This panel is called Personal Approaches to Art Collecting with panelists Kate Chertavian, Pamela Hornik, Lisa Young, and it will be moderated by Elizabeth D., who is the founder of the Independent Fair and Independent 20th Century. So please enjoy. We're at capacity, so if you leave, you probably won't be able to come back in because somebody's waiting to take your spot. So please be as quiet as possible, and thank you for coming, and welcome all of you.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. I'm Elizabeth D. I'm so happy to have been invited to moderate this discussion on collecting today. And I want to just thank the Arrivals leadership team for putting all this together. It's so great to be convening with you up in the Berkshires. So I'm going to basically run this panel in a very relaxed fashion. We're going to keep it to an hour, so I know people have other places to be. We're not going to do Q&A, but we are available afterward for that informally. I just want to give all of our speakers ample time to discuss the topic of collecting. Before we get into that, I want to just invite our panelists to introduce themselves and just say a few words rather than doing a bio. So, do you want to start?
Sure. Is this loud enough? Yeah. Speak louder. Okay. Adjusting the volume. First of all, I just want to really thank the Arrivals team for the invitation and for gathering all of us outside of New York City for a weekend, which is really lovely for me. So I'm a collector. I also run an organization called the Here and There Collective alongside my husband, Stephen Abraham, based in New York. And my collecting journey started around 2017. That's easy to remember because that is the year I got married. And to put a long story short, we started our collection by shortening our wedding guest list by a few folks they never will know, and we reinvested that money to buy some of our first works. So since then, we've kind of just had the collecting bug, and yeah, super excited to be on the panel with you all.
All right, I figured out how to use the microphone. So I'm Pamela, and I have been collecting, I want to say, for about 15 years, which is as long as I've been volunteering at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford. I've had a kind of, I want to say, a frenetic collecting journey. I collect with my husband, and I've been collecting for, like I said, 15 years. I'm a very disorganized collector. It isn't until recently that I finally have a collection manager that is working with me, trying to keep me more organized. But I just have to say, when I saw that I was on this panel, I Googled you, and I looked at how organized and how thoughtful your collection was, and I immediately panicked, and I thought, oh my God, I'm on a panel with someone who has a really thoughtful collection, and I'm sort of like the manic, crazy collector. I think that kind of sums me up.
So I suppose I am not a collector, so we'll start that. I've been building collections for about 30 years. I'm Kate Chertavian. I had a practice in London and now in Boston, and I do build great collections. And I say I am not a collector, but when I come to something like Arrivals, it's a disease. It gets in my head, and emotionally, I've spent about $15,000 walking up down the aisle, so I kind of am. But I am thrilled to be here. I think, sitting next to real collectors, so remember I am not the real collector, but thinking a little bit about what it is to collect, and this infectious enthusiasm you have for collecting at places like this in Arrivals. So kudos to this team for the most remarkable journey they've taken. This is not easy. This is so difficult to do, and I feel as though it's like that duck in the water that's going very quietly, and underneath there's a lot of paddling going on. So anyway, that's me. So I've been doing it for 30 years, building collections for people, but this event is extraordinary.
Great. So we're going to dive into it. I just wanted to assess the audience a little bit. How many people are curators in this room? That's what I thought. Got a nice contingent. And how many people are arts workers? Yeah. And how many people are that plus collectors or just collectors? Okay. So, and then artists. Okay. Thank you. So we have a balanced room today. So I think what I want to do is maybe start by discussing the collecting paradigm, where we both all sit within that, with our own, unique experiences, our own generational experiences, but also where do we think things need to move in terms of collecting the practice generally? Like what excites you now that maybe didn't excite you before about the collecting hunt, and also just maybe the patronage side of things, because I know that's something that, Lisa, you and Pamela share.
Yeah, I think it comes down to how you describe collecting as a practice. I definitely see it that way, and I resonate with your manic sort of collecting practice that I know you were talking about, especially earlier on when you were collecting. It was very much like, let's just consume and get as much in as we can, and kind of that practice changing over time to being a little bit more thoughtful and kind of thinking about sort of longevity and sort of the next steps. And so I do think for collecting for myself, it is really considering collecting as that practice, and that practice evolves over time. And so for me, it was really about considering how can collecting become more of a practice of patronage. And so rather than thinking of the traditional sense of just acquiring artworks and objects that I live with, what are other ways that I can, support the artist and really kind of be a part of this ecosystem in a way that is, yes, it's acquiring works, it's building my own personal collection, but also being in community and really recognizing the ecosystem. And so that's kind of where my practice has taken me over time.
Pamela, how about you?
Well, to be honest, is it on? Yes. Well, to be honest, I never thought about my collecting as a practice. I wish I had earlier on. Maybe it sounds so much better if I say it's a practice. But I came into collecting sort of with no background. I did not grow up with a family that collected art or even went to art galleries. My complete introduction to the art world came from volunteering in a museum. And when I finally found out that you could buy art, which I didn't even realize, I was so excited by it that my husband and I sort of, we went out, we started with artist studios and what was accessible to us, because I think that's my collecting practice has changed over time with what's accessible to me. And I know sometimes we don't talk about that in the art world, and artists don't like to talk about the fact that sometimes galleries don't make their work accessible. But over the course of 15 years, we started, as I said earlier, collecting by going to galleries, begging for them to sell us the work. They wouldn't always sell it to us. That took a lot of work, and having to be known more in the art world before there's some art we could acquire. And we always felt so lucky. We would, as soon as it was accessible, we'd buy it. And I did not think about what of my work can I leave to a museum. It was not on my mind, to be honest, when I first started. At this point in my life, I'm in a different place with my collecting, where I don't buy art the way I would buy black clothing. And then, because you realize that you really are shepherding, you are in charge of caretaking for that art, just like museums are, for the long term. So the caretaking of a collection was something that I didn't really think about until we had so much art that we had to put things in storage. So now I'm in a place which, I know the galleries don't always like to hear it, but I'm being more thoughtful and being more mindful with art and thinking, is this a piece that maybe won't go to my kids, but should go to an institution? And as so many of you, our institutions know, you don't want most of my collection. And no one wants my 250 dogs. So,
you don't know that.
That is actually true. Maybe the Sawa dog. But I just think collecting for me has been such a journey that I've learned so much about myself. And it's really strange to think how much you can evolve in your collecting.
do you want to talk about the stewardship side of it and also how it functions in terms of that arc of collecting? You know, I love what you said about not thinking about any of these things when you first started and just working with your own eye and your own sort of heart, and then learning and it being an intellectual build practice where you have different choices, you make different decisions along the way, and then you start thinking about the legacy of the collection or where it goes. And if, you know, and getting involved with museums, and that part of it is so critical. I'd just love to know how you see that arc of time.
The outsider in the room. No, I mean, it's actually really interesting. I think I started collecting for people. One of my first clients was David Bowie, obviously an amazing musician, and he was a very similar profile. He came into this market and he built the collection to describe himself better. So I often think of collections, if you lined that, you know, that collection along a fence post, it would better describe who you are. So there's an intent to collecting, even if it's an accidental intent when you do it. It is some way of expressing yourself, like the great Isabella Stewart Gardner, like when David Bowie built his collection. It was really this idea of trying to describe your loves, your intent, your purpose. And I love the idea of stewardship, because in all the collections I have, stewardship plays a very important role. Maybe not something you're thinking about when you're trying to fill those critical spots, those first few pieces, but maybe 10 or 15 years down the line, or even 5 years down the line, there's a aha moment and you realize that you spend vast amounts of money buying, insuring, installing artwork that's only with you for your lifetime. Likely your children won't want it, likely the institutions might not want it. So you begin to pivot your head to the artists, and you know that you really are the caretaker for these exquisite objects. So that answers a little bit about that arc of buying. And the arc of buying is, you know, I challenge people who love to collect to go off and do the collecting themselves, to kind of make mistakes, you know, make great acquisitions, accidental acquisitions, build over time. And then there's a moment to assess, maybe bring a third party into that conversation. But that journey, either if it's a partnership or a single journey, is a magnificent journey into sort of self-exploration as well as exploring a community.
And I think there is kind of a natural arc where, you know, someone that I had talked with early on in the collecting journey said, you know, it comes in 7-year cycles. You know, the first 7 years it's all about acquisition. How many, you know, I need to acquire this. Often these artists are the first, you know, works in the collection. And then you're on the second show, third show, there's a museum show. Maybe you start to get involved with, you know, funding the shows, funding the production cycle. And I'd like to talk about what, you know, artists need in this as well. But I think that then the second 7 years is really about, all right, this is our index of artists. Where are we going deep? Where are we not going deep? Let's be strategic about this. We're spending a lot of money. You know, how much of this needs to be institutionally driven? How much of it has to be personally driven? Or does the collection define its own context? And then within that, it goes into a third category of like, maybe I really want to slow down and just be more involved institutionally, and then only when key pieces come up will I actually bring them in. I don't know if you are feeling that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether it's a 7-year or a 10-year, and I actually think some people just stick to a budget, don't spend much money on art, and build magnificent collections. Yeah. So I think this frog in boiling water, which is, you know, you buy, you pick someone good, they go somewhere else, and suddenly you're kind of mortgaging your house to make the acquisition, isn't necessarily the ordinary model. It's the extraordinary model, and it's the disease of collecting. But I do think that these 10-year cycles, 7-year cycles do happen, and I think there is a point where you look at what you have and go, what purpose and why, and what am I going to do with it? All of you collectors, I take my hat off to you. It's not something, I see dear friends that are collectors here. It's a really challenging task. But I always come back to the fact that it's usually just about those artists. It's the love of the artists.
I was just gonna say that the artist is what keeps me in the game and the involvement with the museums. It definitely, it's so interesting because I never realized there was a cycle and that I was just experiencing part of the cycle. I was kind of worried. I thought, oh my God, I don't have that same bug anymore. But I think it is just that at this point where I am in my life, it's important to me to make sure that I'm supporting the artists mainly like in my collection in whatever way that we can. And I happen to sit on the boards of museums that are all free and helping them to fill spots in their collection if possible.
Yeah, that for sure resonates for me. And I also didn't realize there was a known cycle, because like 2017, I'm on like year 8. Yeah, so 7-year cycle. Yeah, that feels about right. But yeah, I think similarly, in sort of the last couple years, like that has for sure been the line of questioning of like, do we, re-up our, sort of like membership dues to an institution, or do we shift the conversation to how can we support an exhibition at an institution? And really kind of being focused about, how we're spending that money and how we're spending that support. And I think to your point, it really does come down to thinking about how can we support the artists, particularly because a lot of the artists in our collection are emerging and now like closer to mid-career. So kind of thinking, like in a lot of ways, I think about the artists that we have early on in our collection as peers, because we were both on this sort of emerging journey, me as an emerging collector, them as an emerging artist. And a lot of the conversations we would have would be like figuring out this thing that's called the art world. And so I think a lot about how like artists have the hardest job because they have to sustain a practice for their lifetime. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do. Like I come from corporate life where you have a career ladder, there's HR, there's like benefits, it's very easy to build a life for yourself. But that's not the case for an artist. You have to be all things all the time, all at once. And so I think it is like thinking about the artist's longevity and how can I, in my position as a collector, be someone who can be supportive of that kind of long-term trajectory. So I think a lot about that too.
And I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think collectors are all sitting in different positions right now, generationally, and we're seeing a really big generational shift. Not to generalize, but I think the fact that you really think through what does my role need to be as a collector to serve the artist, as well as the institution, as well as my own collecting, and where is that intersectionality, I think is really, really interesting. Because now artists are, uniquely tasked with these opportunities that their galleries source for them, which are these, institutional opportunities. These institutions are increasingly underfunded, especially now. Galleries are shoring up that extra support. They're relying on collectors to also be involved. So by default, there's an ecosystem that needs to be filled that's beyond the market and beyond just being, a collector of a particular artist. And I'm just sort of curious where you think the gallery space and also the museum space need to be in order to serve the opportunity further, not only for you as the collector so that you see the benefits and you really are getting the benefits out of the institutional relationship and the artist relationship, but also so the artists feel that they are continuously supported and not completely stressed when they have these opportunities in front of them, which obviously are good problems, but they're still really major problems, especially around production.
I think the most extraordinary thing is to see, 30 years ago, what the contemporary art market looked like. Post-war and contemporary was launched in about 1991 out of the modern British department of Christie's, which I was a member of. But launching this contemporary market, there was no secondary market, contemporary art. So you look at this evolution, and there come the stresses. But these stresses are good stresses, and I do think the most remarkable thing is that all these collectors are stepping into that arena in a very active way. And actually the galleries are too. They're stepping into the arena, and the museums have a very odd role in that they have their curatorial mission, so they can't necessarily always step in partnership. But you do have a very different ecosystem. And the money in the contemporary art market is very different from when the emerging artists I was looking at, like Mr. Damien Hirst many years ago, it was a couple of grand. And we were standing up ladders pouring paint into a spin painting. So you imagine that trajectory that we're looking at, that financial responsibility, it's completely transformed. So being a collector now is a very different thing from being a collector of David's ilk many years ago when he collected contemporary art because it was cheap. And also it was fun, it was his peer group. There was more of a sociability there. You knew someone, you might as well get a piece. It was more, but now it's a measured thing, very different.
And why am I so challenged by this? I was just going to add, there are collectors at all different levels too, and I think like I'm happy to take on the responsibility of supporting museum shows for my artists and helping make their books, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge that a lot of collectors might not be able to do that, and it's just as important just to have people out there buying art at all the different levels. And I think sometimes, I know for myself, I often have like imposter syndrome. Like I see other collectors in Cultured magazine, I'm like, oh, they have a real collection. So I think there's also something about demystifying the art world and letting more people know they can have a role and they can start collecting, buying maybe emerging art, and then that artist becomes mid-career, and then they can, like, kind of sounds like your journey, and then they work with them for their first museum show. But I also think sometimes when we talk about the institutions and supporting artists and museum shows, it can almost like be a deterrent to people who just want to buy art because maybe it makes them happy, and they just want to put something pretty on their wall. And I think there's also like absolutely nothing wrong with that too. And it's almost like in the art world, there's this level of what's a real collector, who is an important collector, and what I really love, I just have to say about this whole fair, it's not about collecting, is I don't feel any of that here, and it feels like a very inclusive art world. So thank you to you guys for doing this.
Yeah, I think the point about there being collectors at every level really resonates for me, and I would say I feel like you can be a patron without spending a lot of money on art. Because when I think about, back in when we started, like, we had no concept of how much our works could be, and sometimes we would look at it and be like, I'm sorry, how much? Even for a photograph? And so we don't come from collecting families as well, and so we were very much like, okay, well, we can spend X amount of dollars this year. And so we would spend that X amount of dollars, but then we were thinking, like, we can just talk about these great artists. We can just spread the word about people so other people can support, so other people can buy. Because, I think we recognize there are so many great artists, particularly in the pandemic. We were just doing all these studio visits. And so that is really the genesis of like the Here and There Collective, where we just started promoting all these artists that we would have studio visits with and archiving those conversations. And we like, check these people out, they're great. And I think in modern times when everyone is discovering things online and on Instagram, like, there's a role to play there, right? Where you're not spending money on buying a ton of work every year, but you are just evangelizing people that you think deserve that sort of recognition. And other people then can recognize and support and do all these things. And so, that really was how we started that project over the pandemic. And then the other prong to that was like, we had an artist that we had visited, still going to school in Columbia. Long story short, the pandemic didn't have access to their studio space. And then we were like, well, if we gave you a studio in Harlem for like 3 months, that's like the equivalent of a painting. So we just funded rent for a studio. And like, that's like, not like a zero cost way, but it's like a lower cost way to like, help keep them going, help keep them making. And that also just kind of spurred into like, okay, well, that seems like a model we can keep up, so let's just do that thing. And that really then became the genesis for an open call and then like a residency. And so I think there's like collectors at every level, there's patrons at every level, and you don't have to spend money, or you can,
And it's a lot of people ask, because of what I do, how do I start collecting? And I say it's really simple. Tithe to yourself. Say, every year I've got $500 and I am going to drive here and I'm going to look and I'm going to see if there's an acquisition. That's all you have to do to become a collector. That is a collection. That first acquisition you make that you're so proud of. And I remember the first acquisition I made, which was literally a drawing of Jesus Christ. I'm a Russian Jew. from the Portobello Road with $300 my godmother gave me, who happened to be an art consultant. And I remember taking it home and saying, I'm now a collector. I have artwork. And I still maintain that tithing, and it's $500 the first year, and I don't care how old you are, if you're going to spend $500 on a pair of sneakers, or whatever you're going to spend it on, spend it on something unique. And those pieces build a collection. It's just that decision. So to become a collection, it's just a decision you made. You guys made a decision. I mean, I see all these decision trees. It might be what you call a chaotic, doesn't sound very chaotic, decision tree, or a very decisive decision tree, but it is that decision to spend money on the creative world.
And you're collecting people too. Who are you in dialogue with about what have you seen and where? Who are you reaching out to for advice? Who's a mentor in the space? And then the gallerists become part of that brain trust. Where you're like, I was thinking about things. I mean, I think what you're talking about, Lisa, working with creative problem solving around the needs of artists once you're involved and invested is often the things that galleries have had the pressure of having to resolve. Like, oh shit, my artist is in the Whitney Biennial or in Venice. Who's going to pay for the studio to produce this new body of work? Do we need to get fabrication involved? Like, how do we... It's just so nice that collectors seem to have a more direct line to the creators now than they once used to. So you probably are more aware of the needs rather than having, 20 years ago, galleries would have to call you and say, you know what, we have a little issue, we're wondering if you'd like to support, here's the problem, here's a potential solution. It sounds like now it's happening much more organically.
This is going to happen every time. Do you think that happens more organically because of the role of something like Instagram? I mean, I know for me, it's embarrassing, but I feel like my art education all came from Instagram. I'm connected to, following you and what you do and following curators, and you sometimes see what those needs are. Artists can post about them, so I think Instagram, for all of its faults, has made, for me at least, the art world feel more accessible in many ways.
And more democratic, right? I mean, just the other day I saw Jacoby Satterwhite is ill, and on Instagram. And there was a GoFundMe for his medical expenses. And so I gave, as I'm a huge fan of his work. I've never met him, but 900 people gave in the last 3 weeks to that endeavor. I mean, the Los Angeles fires were a perfect example of this, right? Where people really do come together. And I think it is social. It's the one benefit of social media. I'd say the downside, at least in my experience, having been a gallerist for almost 20 years, is that it's a lot more pressure on the artist. When I was the director of Loring Augustine in my 20s, we represented Paul McCarthy. If you wanted to talk to Paul McCarthy, you had to talk to me. And then I would talk to Paul about whether he had time to, manage a request, take some time out of the studio, have a conversation. And that was very highly coordinated. Now it's like you DM the artist is overloaded with requests. But then on the flip side, if there's a need, everybody's fully aware of that need. And my question is just sort of how can collectors be involved in more of this kind of problem solving, or change making in the space. Now that we are in an evolutionary period of collecting, we just came out of the COVID period, which was incredibly, boom and bust, maybe, for lack of a better way to describe it, more, in a more sophisticated way. But basically, we've had a 2-year deflationary period of pricing. And to your point about you can have $500 and collect, you really can do that, especially now, because prices have really come down. And it's an opportunity where things are 20% lower in many cases than they were 2 years ago. And I think that's a good thing in terms of rebuilding and coming up, but I think there are gaps that either we can collectively find to solutions to, so that the ecosystem is stronger as things kind of begin to move forward again. Love to hear your thoughts about that.
So I think the observation I've made in the last decade is this flight to fashion, a popular artist, the waiting list, all of that, which were, I think, relatively, and then this terrible secondary market jumping on that and doing fast artists and crucifying artists in the first 10 lots of a sale. This feels like a Swiss cheese approach. I don't know what the cement is, and there's a huge pressure then on the collectors to kind of plug those holes. That's not sustainable, as far as I can see. There will be, I think, quite a large correction in this market, and there will be opportunities. I don't quite know how we shore that up, but I'm not sure it's entirely the responsibility of collectors. So I kind of back away from the idea that it's just at their feet to try and help these artists. I think there should be some regulation. I don't know what that looks like. Artist resale would be great if we bought that, the European model of artist resale.
If artists got a percentage.
If they got a percentage of the resale, that would be fantastic. Also, the idea of some kind of more solid contract with galleries for these artists. I don't know what it looks like, but we are approaching quite a significant disruption. Certainly from where I am in a different marketplace, I'm seeing a lot of disruption happening. So I'm curious to see what will happen the next year or so.
I think one of the things when I was advisor to the Cranwood collection, which is a 20th century collection of new media, one of the things we established with the institutions that we were supporting was collective buying. So, if you're going to buy, Christian Marclay's The Clock, why does, Tate MoMA and SM MoMA have to have the same, the same work? So the idea was, with digital and film, media to be able to, have shared acquisitions. And I think that kind of crowdfunding was, very, very useful. And so that began what was called the New Art Trust, which is a partnership that still exists to this day between Tate, MoMA, and SM MoMA. But I do think on every level, the gallery level, infrastructures should be shifting right now and changing to respond to the needs. So that collectors stay engaged. Because to your point, there is going to be a fatigue, especially now, with there's so many needs coming from so many directions. The museums really do need the funding to do their exhibitions and to do their acquisitions. They need to be able to support the collections that they have, especially more now than ever. Then artists really need the support that galleries are just increasingly stressed with the rising costs. So the idea of being able to also fund the studio and fund the fabricator and get some legal advice around a contract to the Venice Biennale or another major institutional show is a lot. But I think we do have an incredible talent pool when we bring all of these sectors together that could really, strike positive change. And I know you're all doing that in your various ways.
Yeah, it resonates with me in times of stress. That's where you get creative, and I think especially just having conversations with a lot of artists that I'm friends with. This moment is tough for me, and I think that's where you see more clearly where the stress lines lie. And I think that's when it, again, not coming from a collecting family or background in art history, it becomes more apparent to me more aha moments. Again, drawing parallels to corporate life, which is very structured, very regulated, right? Those sort of the stark differences there become even greater in their contrast, and that's where we can be okay, well, now that I've identified that, let's figure it out, right? You have a show coming up and you need to figure out how to fund it. Well, let's tap into the network of people, and to your point, it's crowdsourcing, right? It doesn't all have to be on me, it doesn't all have to be on one person. Let's gather the community to really rally behind very specific problems, and I think that's, for me at least, is happening.
And I actually find the current moment, with however you define it, because it's weird. I'm art I'm looking at is still really expensive. So I don't know whose art is less now, but anyway, I find the current moment really frustrating because I don't have endless funds to give, and I find myself who do I support? Where should it go? And something that just brought me a lot of joy and satisfaction was supporting. We have the Headlands Arts Residency in California, and I just went to their gala, and that sort of felt like a way to support the galleries, the residency, and artists. So I think it's going to be more about collaborating, having different institutions collaborate and work with the galleries, because like the two of us single-handedly cannot buy all the art to save the galleries. I wish I could.